The morning sun cast long shadows across the settlement as Sarah knelt beside the well, drawing water for what she feared might be the last time. Her hands trembled as she pulled the rope, not from the weight of the bucket, but from the weight of the whispers that had followed her for months. At 28, she had been married to Thomas for 7 years, and still, her belly remained flat, her arms empty of the children that every woman in their small frontier community was expected to bear. The other women had stopped including her in their conversations about pregnancies and child-rearing. Their eyes held a mixture of pity and suspicion when they looked at her now. In their minds, a woman who could not fulfill her most basic purpose was either cursed by God or touched by something darker. Sarah had heard the whispered prayers they said when they thought she couldn't hear, asking the Lord to protect their own wombs from whatever affliction had taken hold of hers. Thomas had grown distant over the past year. Where once he had been patient and kind, offering gentle reassurances that God's timing was not their own, now he barely spoke to her except to give instructions about the household tasks. She could see the shame in his eyes when other men spoke proudly of their sons and daughters. His silence at those moments cut deeper than any harsh words could have. The settlement of Millbrook had been established 15 years earlier by families seeking to build godly lives away from the corruption of the larger cities. They lived by strict biblical principles, and the community elders made decisions based on their interpretation of Scripture. Elder Morrison, a stern man with gray hair and harder eyes, had been watching Sarah with increasing disapproval. She had noticed him speaking quietly with other members of the church council after services, their glances turning toward her and Thomas. That afternoon, as Sarah tended to her small vegetable garden behind their log cabin, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the spaces between the fence posts, she could see Elder Morrison riding up their path, accompanied by 2 other church elders and Thomas's younger brother, James. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the grim expressions on their faces. This was not a social visit. Thomas emerged from their cabin, wiping his hands on a cloth. He had been working on repairs to their roof, trying to prepare for the harsh winter that would soon descend upon them. The men dismounted and formed a semicircle around him. Sarah crept closer to the back wall of the cabin, pressing her ear against the rough wooden logs to hear their conversation. "Thomas," Elder Morrison began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "the council has been praying about the situation with your wife. We've discussed this matter at length, and we believe the Lord has given us direction." "What situation?" Thomas asked, though his voice lacked conviction. He knew exactly what they had come to discuss. "Brother, you've been married 7 years with no children. This is not natural. Scripture tells us that children are a blessing from the Lord, and the barren woman is one he has chosen not to bless. We must consider why that might be." James stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment but his words firm. "Thomas, you're my brother, and I love you, but the community is starting to talk. Some are saying that Sarah might be afflicted, that her barrenness is a sign of God's displeasure or worse. What are you suggesting?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elder Morrison pulled a worn Bible from his coat and opened it to a marked passage. Deuteronomy chapter 28 speaks of the curses that come upon those who do not obey the Lord. Among them is the curse of the barren womb. We must consider that Sarah's condition may be a manifestation of hidden sin or even darker influences. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. They were suggesting she was cursed, or worse, that she was somehow in league with evil forces. In their isolated community, such accusations were tantamount to a death sentence. Furthermore, Elder Morrison continued, her barrenness is affecting the entire community. Other women are becoming fearful. Just last week, Mary Henderson asked if she should avoid Sarah's company while she carries her child, worried that whatever curse affects Sarah might spread to her. Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring at the ground. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with resignation. "What does the council suggest?" "The community needs to be protected," Elder Morrison replied, "and Sarah needs to be removed from situations where she might bring harm to others. There's a place about 3 miles north of here where the old mine shaft caves in. It's isolated away from the settlement. We believe she should be taken there and confined until God reveals his will." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. They were talking about burying her alive, sealing her in a cave to die slowly in the darkness. Her legs gave way, and she slumped against the cabin wall, struggling to breathe. "You're talking about murder," Thomas said, but his voice held no real protest, only weary acceptance. "We're talking about protecting the community from a curse," James interjected. "Thomas, think about it. 7 years of marriage, and not even one miscarriage. It's not natural. And look at what's happened since you married her. The Johnsons lost 2 children to fever. The Williams family's crops failed 3 years running. Mrs. Peterson died in childbirth last spring. These things didn't happen before Sarah came to our community." Sarah wanted to scream that these were coincidences, that life on the frontier was hard, and people died, crops failed, and children fell sick regardless of who lived among them. But she knew that fear and superstition were stronger than logic in times of hardship. "The decision has been made," Elder Morrison announced. "Tomorrow at dawn, we'll come for her. It would be best if you weren't here, Thomas. Take some supplies and visit your cousin in Springfield for a few days. When you return, you can begin the process of finding a new wife, one who can give you the children God intends for you to have." The men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Thomas standing alone in their yard. Sarah remained pressed against the cabin wall, tears streaming down her face. She could hear Thomas moving around inside, the sound of him packing clothes and supplies into his traveling bag. He was actually going to leave her to face this alone. As evening fell, Thomas finally came outside. He found Sarah sitting on the front steps, her face pale but composed. They looked at each other for a long moment without speaking. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered. "I don't know what else to do. If I try to stop them, they'll just say I'm under your influence too. They might decide both of us are cursed. So you're going to let them bury me alive to save yourself?" Sarah asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Thomas couldn't meet her eyes. Maybe God will provide a way out for you. Maybe this is all part of his plan. God's plan is for innocent women to be murdered by frightened, ignorant men. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under," Thomas said, his voice rising defensively. "Every Sunday, listening to other men talk about their children while I sit there empty-handed. Every community gathering where you stand apart from the other women because you have nothing to contribute to their conversations about motherhood. I'm tired of the shame, Sarah. I'm tired of being pitted." The words cut deeper than any physical wound could have. Her husband, the man who had promised to love and protect her, was more concerned about his reputation than her life. That night, Sarah lay awake in their bed while Thomas slept beside her, his breathing deep and regular, as if he had no concerns weighing on his mind. She stared at the ceiling, trying to think of any possible escape. She could try to run, but where would she go? A woman alone on the frontier had little chance of survival, especially with winter approaching. She had no money, no relatives within hundreds of miles, and no skills that would allow her to support herself in a town. She thought about her life before coming to Millbrook. She had been born in Philadelphia, the daughter of a shopkeeper. Her family had been comfortable, though not wealthy. She had received a basic education and had expected to marry someone from their neighborhood, perhaps have a few children, and live out her days in the familiar surroundings of the city. But then she had met Thomas at a church social during one of his visits to the city. He had been charming and earnest, speaking passionately about the godly life he was building in the frontier settlement. The idea of adventure, of being part of something important and pure, had captured her imagination. Her parents had been reluctant to let her move so far away, but Thomas had convinced them that she would be cherished and protected in their small community. He had painted a picture of a place where Christian values guided every decision, where neighbors supported each other through hardship, and where she would find purpose and fulfillment as a wife and mother. Now, 7 years later, she was about to die because those same Christian values had been twisted into something cruel and superstitious. The community that was supposed to protect her had decided she was a threat that needed to be eliminated. As the first light of dawn began to filter through their small window, Sarah heard the sound of approaching horses. Her time had run out. Thomas stirred beside her, then sat up abruptly as he too heard the sounds outside. Without a word, he rose and began dressing quickly. "Thomas," Sarah said softly, making one last attempt to reach the man she had once loved. "Please, don't let them do this. We could leave together, start over somewhere else. It's not too late." He paused in, buttoning his shirt, his back turned to her. For a moment, she thought she had reached him. Then, his shoulders straightened with resolve. "I can't," he said quietly. This is my home, my community. These are my people. I won't throw away everything I've built for." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. He wouldn't throw it away for her. The knock on their door came just as the sun crested the horizon. Elder Morrison's voice called out, "Thomas, it's time." Thomas finished dressing and picked up his traveling bag. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at Sarah one last time. She was sitting on the edge of their bed, still in her nightgown, her dark hair falling around her shoulders. For just a moment, his face softened with something that might have been regret or love. "Goodbye, Sarah," he whispered, and then he was gone. Sarah heard him speaking briefly with the men outside, the sound of his horse being brought around, and then the fading hoofbeats as he rode away to safety, leaving her to face her fate alone. The door opened without ceremony, and Elder Morrison stepped inside, followed by James and two other men Sarah recognized from church. They looked uncomfortable but determined, like men carrying out an unpleasant but necessary duty. "Sarah," Elder Morrison said, his tone formal and cold, "you need to come with us. Get dressed. May I ask what you believe I've done to deserve this?" Sarah asked as she reached for the simple brown dress that hung on a peg near the bed. "It's not about what you've done," Elder Morrison replied. "It's about what you represent. Your barrenness is a sign, Sarah. The Lord is speaking through your empty womb, warning us of corruption in our midst. And you think murdering me will solve that? We're not murdering you. We're placing you in God's hands. If He wills it, He will provide a way for you to escape. If not, then His judgment will be carried out." Sarah dressed quickly, her mind racing as she tried to think of any possible argument that might change their minds. But she could see in their faces that their decision was final. They had convinced themselves that they were doing God's work, and nothing she could say would penetrate that certainty. They bound her hands behind her back and helped her onto a horse. The small procession rode through the settlement in the early morning light. Sarah could see faces peering out of windows, watching her final journey. Some looked sorrowful. Others appeared satisfied that justice was being done. Not one person came forward to protest or offer help. The ride to the old mine took nearly an hour. The mine had been abandoned years before when the vein of iron ore had played out. The entrance was a dark opening in a rocky hillside, partially collapsed and overgrown with brush. It was the perfect place to hide a terrible secret. The men dismounted and pulled Sarah from her horse. They had brought shovels and tools to complete their grim work. Elder Morrison approached the mine entrance and peered into the darkness. "This will do," he announced. "James, help me clear some of this debris from the opening." As the men worked to prepare her tomb, Sarah found herself thinking not of death, but of all the life she would never live. She thought of the children she would never hold, the gray hair she would never grow, the love she would never find with someone who truly cherished her. The waste of it all seemed worse than the terror. When they had cleared enough space, two of the men took her arms and began walking her toward the mine entrance. The opening yawned before her like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. The darkness beyond was complete and terrifying. "Please," she said one final time, her voice barely audible. "I've done nothing wrong. I've been a faithful wife, a devoted Christian, a good neighbor. My only crime is that my body cannot do something that isn't entirely within my control." Elder Morrison looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Sarah, if you're truly innocent, then God will deliver you. Have faith." They pushed her into the mine entrance, and she stumbled forward into the darkness. Behind her, she could hear them beginning to pile rocks and debris across the opening. Slowly, systematically, they sealed her inside. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared and complete darkness enveloped her, Sarah sank to her knees on the rocky floor of the mine. The air was stale and cold, and she could hear water dripping somewhere in the depths below her. This place would be her world now, for however long she had left to live. The sound of the men's voices grew fainter as they completed their work and prepared to leave. Soon, there was only silence and the terrible weight of stone between her and the world she would never see again. Sarah closed her eyes, though it made no difference in the absolute darkness, and tried to pray. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself wondering if somewhere in the vast wilderness beyond these hills, there might be someone who would see the evil that had been done here and care enough to set it right. The first day in a mine passed like a nightmare from which Sarah couldn't wake. She had tried everything she could think of to escape. Her bound hands made movement difficult, but she had managed to work her way along the walls of the narrow mine shaft, feeling for any gap in the rocks that might provide an exit. The men had done their work thoroughly. Every possible opening was blocked with stones too heavy for her to move, even if her hands had been free. The mine shaft extended deeper into the earth than she had expected. In her desperate exploration, she had followed the main tunnel for what felt like hundreds of yards before it branched into smaller passages that led into impenetrable darkness. Some of these passages seemed to descend steeply, and she could hear the echo of water dripping far below. The sound was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant there was water somewhere in this place, terrifying because it suggested depths she couldn't fathom. Her stomach had begun to cramp with hunger by the time she estimated the first day had ended. Time had no meaning in the absolute darkness of the mine. She tried to keep track by reciting prayers and hymns she had learned as a child, but even those familiar words seemed to lose their meaning in this place of abandonment. When exhaustion finally overcame her fear, she curled up against one of the walls and tried to sleep, but every sound, the skittering of small creatures, the settling of rocks, the endless dripping of water, sent jolts of terror through her body. By what she guessed was the second day, the ropes around her wrists had rubbed her skin raw. She had been working constantly to loosen them, twisting and pulling despite the pain. The rough hemp had cut into her flesh, and she could feel blood making the bond slippery. Finally, after hours of effort that left her gasping and weak, she managed to work one hand free. The relief was so overwhelming that she wept, her sobs echoing through the empty corridors of the mine. With her hands free, she was able to explore more thoroughly. She discovered that the main shaft had several levels, connected by natural gaps in the rock, where she could carefully climb down if she was willing to risk a fall in the darkness. The miners who had worked here years before had left behind some equipment, broken pick handles, pieces of rusty metal, and scraps of cloth that had once been used to bundle their tools. None of it was useful for escape, but finding these remnants of human presence made her feel slightly less alone. It was on the third day that she first heard the voices. At first, she thought she was hallucinating from hunger and stress. The voices seemed to come from very far away, echoing down the shaft from the blocked entrance above. But as she listened more carefully, she realized that people were actually standing near the mine entrance, talking in normal conversational tones. She recognized Elder Morrison's voice immediately. "The deed is done," he was saying to someone. "The community is already feeling the relief." Martha Peterson mentioned that her youngest child's fever broke yesterday, first time in a week. "And Thomas?" asked another voice that Sarah thought might belong to Dr. Williams. "He returned this morning. Naturally, he's grieving, but he understands that this was necessary. James has already spoken to him about the widow Collins over in Springfield. She's a godly woman with proven fertility, 2 children from her first marriage. Thomas could do worse." Sarah pressed herself against the rocks that blocked the entrance, straining to hear every word. They were already planning Thomas's replacement for her, as if she had never existed. "What about the burial?" Dr. Williams asked. "Shouldn't there be some kind of service?" Elder Morrison's laugh was cold and humorless. "Doctor, we couldn't very well hold a Christian burial for someone whose barrenness marked her as cursed. That would be inviting God's judgment on the entire congregation. No, it's better this way. The community will move forward, and, in time, people will forget she was ever here." "Still seems harsh," Dr. Williams murmured. "Sometimes harsh measures are necessary to protect the faithful," Elder Morrison replied firmly. "The Lord gave us clear instructions about dealing with those who bring curses upon his people. We've simply followed his guidance." The voices faded as the men moved away, leaving Sarah alone with the devastating knowledge that the community she had called home for 7 years was already celebrating her death. There would be no rescue attempt, no second thoughts about the justice of their actions. They had convinced themselves that burying her alive was an act of righteousness, and they were sleeping peacefully at night because of it. That night, or what she estimated to be night based on her mental timekeeping, Sarah experienced the first of what would become recurring dreams about her life before Millbrook. She dreamed of her parents' shop in Philadelphia, with its warm yellow light spilling out onto the cobblestone street. In her dream, her mother was arranging bolts of fabric in the front window, while her father helped the customer select buttons for a new coat. The shop smelled of lavender sachets and fresh cotton, and the sound of normal life. Carriages passing outside, children playing, neighbors calling greetings to each other, filled the air. She woke from this dream with tears on her cheeks and a pain in her chest that had nothing to do with hunger. The contrast between the warm, living world of her memory and the cold, dead silence of the mind was almost unbearable. By the fourth day, her hunger had become a constant, gnawing pain that made it difficult to think clearly. She had found the source of the dripping water she had been hearing, a slow seepage through a crack in the rock wall that had formed a small pool in one of the lower chambers. The water was cold and tasted slightly metallic, but it was clean enough to drink. She had no way to carry it with her, so she made regular trips to this chamber, feeling her way carefully through the darkness to avoid falling into one of the deeper shafts. It was during one of these trips to the water that she encountered the rats. She had been kneeling beside the small pool, cupping water in her hands to drink, when she heard the sound of many small feet scurrying across stone. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but then she felt something brush against her skirt. Then another something, and another. In her terror, she jerked backward and knocked over the small stone she had been using to mark her path to the water. The sounds of the rats seemed to come from everywhere at once, squeaking, scratching, the soft padding of dozens of tiny feet moving through the tunnels around her. She pressed herself against the wall and tried to remain perfectly still, hoping they would ignore her if she didn't threaten them. But her breathing was ragged with fear, and she could hear them getting closer. When the first rat actually touched her hand, she couldn't suppress a scream that echoed through the mine like the cry of a banshee. To her surprise, the rats seemed as startled by her scream as she was by their presence. The scurrying sounds moved away quickly, and soon the chamber was quiet again except for the eternal dripping of water. But the encounter left her shaking and even more aware of how vulnerable she was in this place. The rats were probably more afraid of her than she was of them, but they were also competitors for the limited water source. And if she died here, they would not hesitate to make use of her body. The thought of her bones being scattered through these tunnels by scavenging rats gave her a surge of desperate energy. She would not die passively in this place. If she was going to die, it would be while fighting to live, not while waiting for death to claim her. She began a more systematic exploration of the mine, using small stones to mark passages she had already investigated, so she wouldn't waste energy covering the same ground repeatedly. Some of the tunnels were too narrow for her to squeeze through, but others opened into larger chambers that the miners had excavated in their search for ore. In one of these chambers, she found something that gave her the first hope she had felt since being sealed in the mine. Air was moving through this chamber. Not the stale, dead air that filled most of the mine, but a slight current that carried the faint scent of pine trees and earth. Somewhere, somehow, this chamber was connected to the outside world. She spent hours feeling along every inch of the chamber walls, searching for the source of the air current. Finally, near the ceiling of the chamber, she found a gap between rocks that was too small to see but large enough for air to pass through. When she pressed her face to the gap, she could actually feel cool, fresh air against her skin. The gap was far too small for her to escape through, but it gave her something precious, proof that escape was theoretically possible. If air could get through, then, with enough time and effort, maybe she could enlarge the opening enough to squeeze through. She had no tools except her bare hands and the scattered debris left behind by the miners, but she began working at the gap with desperate determination. The work was agonizing. Her fingers were soon cut and bleeding from scraping against the sharp edges of the rocks, and the opening was so high that she had to stand on her toes and stretch her arms overhead to reach it. But every tiny pebble she managed to work loose felt like a victory. The work gave her something to focus on besides her hunger and fear. She developed a routine. Work at the gap until exhaustion forced her to stop, rest for what she estimated to be an hour, drink water from the pool in the lower chamber, then return to work. She tried to work quietly, afraid that if any sounds of her efforts reached the surface, someone might come to investigate and seal this potential escape route as well. On the sixth day, she made a discovery that both terrified and encouraged her. While working at the gap, she heard something that made her freeze in place, the sound of hoofbeats passing somewhere above her. They were distant and muffled, but definitely the sound of horses moving across the landscape. This meant that the gap she was working to enlarge led to somewhere close to a trail or road. But the sound also reminded her that she was not the only living thing moving through this wilderness. The Cheyenne tribe had territory not far from Millbrook, and hunting parties sometimes ranged through this area. The settlers had an uneasy relationship with the Cheyenne, not openly hostile, but marked by mutual suspicion and fear. If she did manage to escape the mine, she might find herself facing dangers in the wilderness that were as great as the danger she faced in this underground prison. Still, the possibility of dying under an open sky seemed infinitely preferable to dying buried alive in the darkness. She continued working at the gap with renewed energy, ignoring the pain in her bleeding fingers and the weakness in her limbs from lack of food. By the seventh day, she had managed to enlarge the opening enough to get her hand through up to the wrist. Fresh air flowed through more freely now, and she could hear birds singing somewhere in the world above. The sound of life continuing outside her tomb made her cry with both joy and frustration. Her hunger was becoming critical. She had tried eating some of the moss that grew near the water source, but it had made her violently sick and weak. She was beginning to understand that even if she managed to escape the mine, she would emerge so weakened by hunger that survival in the wilderness might be impossible. But she refused to give up. Every night, she dreamed of breathing fresh air again, of feeling sunlight on her face, of walking on ground that didn't echo with the hollow sound of an underground tomb. These dreams sustained her through the agonizing work of enlarging her escape route one tiny pebble at a time. It was on the eighth day that she heard the sound that would change everything, the haunting call of a wolf, somewhere not far from her location. The sound was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Beautiful because it represented the wild freedom of creatures that knew no masters. Terrifying because it reminded her that the wilderness beyond the mine was full of predators that would see a weak, starving woman as easy prey. But as she listened to the wolf's call echoing through the gap she had been working to enlarge, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She would rather face the wolves as a free woman than die slowly in this dark prison as a victim of human cruelty. Whatever dangers waited in the wilderness, they could not be worse than the certainty of death she faced in the mine. She returned to her work with fierce determination, and by what she estimated to be the middle of the ninth day, the opening was large enough for her to push her head and shoulders through. Beyond the gap, she could see a narrow crevice between rocks that led upward toward what looked like daylight. The space was barely wide enough for a human body, and the climb looked treacherous, but it was a path to freedom. As she prepared to attempt her escape, Sarah took one last look around the mine that had been her prison and nearly her tomb. She felt no sadness at leaving this place, only a grim satisfaction that the men who had buried her here, believing they were carrying out God's will, had underestimated both her determination to survive and the possibility that their God might have other plans for her fate. She squeezed through the opening she had spent days enlarging, scraping her shoulders and hips on the rough stone, and began the climb toward the light above. The climb through the narrow crevice was the most difficult thing Sarah had ever attempted. The space was barely wide enough for her thin frame, and sharp rocks tore her dress and scraped against her skin with every movement upward. Several times she became wedged between the walls and had to work herself free by exhaling completely and twisting her body into impossible positions. Her hands, already raw and bleeding from days of working at the gap, left smears of blood on the stone as she pulled herself higher. But with each foot of progress, the light above grew stronger and the air fresher. After what felt like hours of climbing, her hand finally emerged into open air. She pulled herself through the opening and collapsed on a solid ground, gasping and sobbing with relief and exhaustion. She was lying in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, their branches swaying gently in a breeze that felt like heaven against her skin after 9 days of stale underground air. The sun was low in the western sky, casting long shadows through the forest. She had emerged nearly 3 miles from the mine entrance, in country that was wilder and more rugged than the settled land around Millbrook. For several minutes, she simply lay there, overwhelmed by the sensation of being free. The sounds of the forest, birds calling, wind moving through branches, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, seemed like a symphony after the dead silence of the mine. The sky above her, even gray with approaching evening, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. But reality soon intruded on her joy. She was free, but she was also alone in wilderness country with no food, no shelter, and no clear idea of which direction might lead to safety. Her dress was torn to shreds, her hands and arms were cut and bleeding, and she was so weak from hunger that standing required enormous effort. As she struggled to her feet, she became aware that she was not alone in the clearing. 20 yards away, partially hidden behind a large pine tree, a man sat motionless on horseback, watching her. Her heart stopped as their eyes met across the distance. He was clearly not from Millbrook or any of the neighboring settlements. His skin was bronzed by sun and weather, his black hair hung loose around his shoulders, and he wore buckskin clothing decorated with beadwork. A Cheyenne warrior, she realized, probably a hunter tracking deer or elk through this forest. She had escaped one death only to walk directly into another. They stared at each other without moving for what felt like an eternity. Sarah was too weak to run and too exhausted to feel proper fear. If this was how she was going to die, at least it would be under an open sky rather than buried alive in the darkness. She waited for him to reach for the tomahawk that hung from his belt or to signal to others who might be hidden nearby. Instead, he dismounted slowly and approached her with cautious, measured steps. His dark eyes took in her torn clothing, her bleeding hands, and the obvious signs of starvation and abuse. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "You are hurt," he said, his voice neither threatening nor sympathetic, simply stating an observation. Sarah found her voice with difficulty. "Yes." He studied her for another moment, his gaze moving from her face to the rocky crevice she had emerged from. "You came from underground." It wasn't a question, and Sarah nodded. She had no reason to lie and no energy to construct a story that might make her situation seem less desperate than it actually was. "How long?" he asked. 9 days, she whispered. Something changed in his expression, a flicker of something that might have been surprise or respect. "You survived 9 days underground." "Barely." He walked a slow circle around her, not threateningly, but like a hunter examining an unusual track. "Your people did this to you." Again, it wasn't a question. Sarah wondered how he could read the situation so clearly just from looking at her. "Yes," she admitted. He stopped in front of her and met her eyes directly. "Why?" The simple question opened a floodgate of emotion that Sarah hadn't expected. All the pain and betrayal and bewilderment of the past 9 days came pouring out of her in a torrent of words. "Because I couldn't have children. Because they decided God was cursing our community through my empty womb. Because they were afraid and needed someone to blame for every misfortune that befell them. Because my husband was ashamed of being married to a barren woman and was willing to let them murder me rather than defend me." She was sobbing now, great gulping sobs that shook her entire body. The Cheyenne warrior listened without interruption until her words dissolved into incoherent crying. When she finally fell silent, he reached into a pouch of his belt and pulled out a piece of dried meat, which he offered to her. Sarah looked at the food in his outstretched hand, then at his face. "Why would you help me?" "You fought to live," he said simply. "That deserves respect." The dried meat was tough and salty, but it was the most wonderful thing Sarah had ever tasted. As she ate, the warrior walked back to his horse and returned with a water pouch. The water was clean and cool, flavored with herbs she didn't recognize. "What is your name?" he asked as she drank. "Sarah. I'm called Many Horses. I was tracking an elk when I heard sound from the rocks. I thought perhaps an animal was trapped, but when you emerged..." He shrugged. "A woman who can survive 9 days buried alive is not an ordinary person." "I'm not special," Sarah protested. "I was just afraid to die." Many Horses considered this. "Among my people, we believe that survival against impossible odds is a sign that the spirits have plans for a person. Your underground journey was like a death and rebirth. You are not the same woman who was buried 9 days ago." Sarah wasn't sure what to make of this interpretation of her experience. She felt profoundly changed by what she had endured, but she hadn't thought of it in spiritual terms. "What will you do now?" Many Horses asked. The question hit her like a physical blow. What would she do? She couldn't return to Millbrook. They believed she was dead, and if they discovered she had survived, they would probably kill her in a more direct way. She had no money, no possessions except the torn dress on her back, and no idea how to survive alone in the wilderness. I don't know, she admitted. I have nowhere to go. Many Horses was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. My band has a winter camp 2 days ride from here. We will be there until the spring hunting begins. You could come with me. The offer was so unexpected that Sarah wasn't sure she had heard correctly. Come with you? But I'm white. I'm not part of your people. You are a woman who has proven her strength. My grandmother believes that people who survive impossible things have medicine, power that can help the tribe. She would want to meet you. Sarah tried to process this. The Cheyenne were offering her sanctuary, while her own people had tried to murder her for the crime of being unable to bear children. The irony was almost overwhelming. But I know nothing about your ways. I wouldn't know how to live among your people. You knew nothing about surviving underground for 9 days, but you learned, Many Horses pointed out. Besides, it would not be permanent unless you chose to make it so. In the spring, when the weather grows warm and travel is easier, you could decide where you want to go and what you want to do with your new life. The phrase new life resonated deeply with Sarah. That's exactly what this felt like, not a continuation of her old existence, but the beginning of something completely different. The woman who had been Sarah the barren wife, Sarah the disappointment, Sarah the curse upon the community, had died in that mine. The woman who had clawed her way back to the surface was someone entirely new. Would your people accept me? She asked. Some would welcome you immediately. Others would need time to trust you. But my grandmother has great influence in the band, and if she accepts you as a person of power, the others will follow her guidance. As if to emphasize his words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the forest. Many Horses turned toward the sound without alarm, and soon 3 other Cheyenne warriors rode into the clearing. They pulled up short when they saw Sarah, their faces registering surprise and suspicion. The eldest of the 3, a man with gray streaks in his hair and scars on his chest that spoke of many battles, addressed Many Horses in rapid Cheyenne. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but the tone made it clear that he was questioning the presence of a white woman in their hunting territory. Many Horses replied in the same language, gesturing toward the rocky crevice, and then towards Sarah. As he spoke, the expressions of the other warriors changed from suspicion to amazement. When he finished, they stared at Sarah with new respect. The eldest warrior rode closer and looked down at her with keen eyes. When he spoke, it was in heavily accented English. You lived underground for 9 suns? Yes, Sarah replied. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had expected. Strong medicine, he said to Many Horses in English, apparently for Sarah's benefit. Grandmother will want to see her. The other warriors agreed, and it was decided that they would camp in this clearing for the night and begin the journey to the winter camp in the morning. Sarah was amazed at how quickly they transformed the clearing into a comfortable camp. Within an hour, they had a fire burning, horses unsaddled and hobbled to graze, and a meal of venison and wild roots cooking over the flames. As they ate, Many Horses told the others Sarah's story in more detail. She was struck by how different their reaction was from what she would have expected from the people of Millbrook. Instead of viewing her barrenness as a curse or a moral failing, they seemed to see it as simply one aspect of her story, no more significant than the color of her hair or the sound of her voice. Among our people, Many Horses explained to her, a woman's worth is not measured only by the children she bears. We value many kinds of strength, the strength to survive hardship, the strength to make wise decisions, the strength to help the tribe in times of danger. You have shown that you possess these things. That night, as Sarah lay wrapped in a warm buffalo robe beside the fire, she stared up at the stars she had thought she would never see again. The Cheyenne warriors took turns keeping watch, but they had included her in their protective circle as naturally as if she had always been part of their band. For the first time in 9 days, she felt safe. More than safe, she felt valued, respected, even honored. The contrast with her treatment by the Christian community that had raised her was so stark that it forced her to question everything she had been taught about civilization, morality, and the proper way to treat other human beings. The next morning, they broke camp early and began the journey to the winter camp. Many Horses had given Sarah a spare set of buckskin clothing that belonged to his sister, and she was amazed at how much more practical it was than the heavy dresses she had always worn. The buckskin was soft and flexible, allowing her to move freely, and it was decorated with beautiful beadwork and patterns that seemed to tell stories. As they rode through the wilderness, many horses pointed out features of the landscape, which plants were edible, how to read the signs that indicated the presence of game animals, where to find the cleanest water. Sarah absorbed every piece of information eagerly, understanding that this knowledge could mean the difference between life and death in this new world she was entering. The journey took 2 full days, as many horses had predicted. They traveled through country that was more rugged and beautiful than anything Sarah had seen during her sheltered life in Millbrook. Deep valleys cut through rolling hills, and streams ran clear and cold over beds of smooth stones. They saw elk, deer, and even a small herd of buffalo in the distance. The abundance of wildlife was overwhelming to someone who had spent years in a farming community where every acre was carefully cultivated and controlled. On the afternoon of the second day, they crested a hill and looked down into a broad valley where the Cheyenne winter camp was laid out along the banks of a winding river. Sarah counted more than 40 lodges, their conical shapes arranged in rough circles with wide spaces between them for horses and daily activities. Smoke rose from cook fires, and she could see people moving about their daily tasks. Women working on hides, men crafting weapons and tools, children playing games in the open areas between the lodges. "It's beautiful," she said and meant it. The camp had an organic quality that was completely different from the rigid geometric layout of Millbrook, where every building was placed according to a careful plan designed to demonstrate order and control over the landscape. "It is home," many horses replied simply. As their small party descended toward the camp, people began to notice their approach. Children ran ahead to spread the news, and by the time they reached the first circle of lodges, a crowd had gathered to see the white woman who had supposedly survived 9 days underground. Many horses led her directly to the largest lodge in the camp, where an ancient woman sat on a beautifully decorated buffalo robe, surrounded by several younger women who were clearly her daughters and granddaughters. This, Sarah realized, must be the grandmother whose approval would determine her fate among these people. The old woman's eyes were milky with cataracts, but her gaze seemed to penetrate directly to Sarah's soul as many horses helped her dismount and approach the lodge. The grandmother listened without interruption as many horses recounted Sarah's story in Cheyenne, occasionally asking questions that Sarah couldn't understand, but that seemed to satisfy the old woman. When the story was complete, the grandmother beckoned Sarah closer. With movements that were slow but sure, she reached out and took Sarah's hands, turning them palm up to examine the cuts and scars from her escape from the mine. She ran her fingers over the healing wounds, nodding as if they confirmed something important. Then, to Sarah's amazement, the grandmother began to smile. She spoke rapidly in Cheyenne to the women around her, and Sarah saw their faces light up with what looked like joy and excitement. "What is she saying?" Sarah asked many horses. "She says that your hands tell the story of a woman who refused to accept death when others tried to force it upon her. She says that such a woman has powerful medicine and will bring strength to our people. She wants to adopt you as her granddaughter and teach you the ways of the Cheyenne." Sarah felt tears starting in her eyes. After a lifetime of being told she was worthless because she couldn't bear children, she was being welcomed into a new family based solely on her strength and courage. "Tell her," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell her that I would be honored to learn from her and to serve the people who have shown me such kindness." As many horses translated her words, the grandmother's smile grew even broader. She spoke again, and the women around her began to laugh and chatter excitedly. "She says that your underground journey was your winter sleep, and now you are ready to be reborn as a daughter of the Cheyenne. She says that spring will bring many changes, and you will be part of them." As the sun set over the winter camp and the cooking fires began to glow in the gathering darkness, Sarah found herself surrounded by women who were welcoming her into their circle with a warmth she had never experienced. They brought her food, helped her set up sleeping robes in the grandmother's lodge, and began teaching her the first words of their language. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt like she belonged somewhere completely and unconditionally. The woman who had been buried alive for her barrenness had died in that mine. The woman who emerged had found a new people, a new family, and a new understanding of what it meant to be truly valued and loved. The first month in the Cheyenne winter camp passed like a dream for Sarah. Every day brought new experiences that challenged everything she had believed about how people should live. The grandmother, whose name was Singing Bird, became her constant teacher and protector. Despite her advanced age and failing eyesight, Singing Bird possessed a sharp mind and an intuitive understanding of human nature that amazed Sarah daily. Under Singing Bird's guidance, Sarah learned to perform the tasks that were essential to survival in the camp. She learned to prepare hides for tanning, to identify and gather medicinal plants even in winter, to cook traditional foods over an open fire, and to create clothing and household items from materials provided by the buffalo, deer, and elk that the hunters brought to camp. The work was harder than anything she had done in her life, but it was also more satisfying. In Millbrook, her days had been filled with activities that seemed designed mainly to demonstrate proper Christian domesticity. Elaborate meals that took hours to prepare for just 2 people, fancy needlework that served no practical purpose, and the maintenance of household possessions that were more about status than utility. Here, every task had a clear purpose related to the survival and well-being of the community. What struck Sarah most profoundly was how different the Cheyenne women's lives were from what she had expected based on stories told by white settlers. The women she had grown up hearing about were supposedly oppressed and worked like slaves by their savage husbands. But the reality was completely different. Cheyenne women owned their own lodges, controlled the distribution of food and resources, and had significant influence in tribal decisions. They worked hard, but so did the men, and there was a clear sense that both genders' contributions were valued and necessary. Singing Bird seemed particularly interested in teaching Sarah about the spiritual aspects of Cheyenne life. Your people believe that the spirit world and the physical world are separate things, she explained one evening as they sat by the fire working on beadwork. But they're not separate. Everything is connected: the earth, the sky, the animals, the plants, the people. When you were buried underground, you were forced to understand this connection. The earth could have killed you, but instead it protected you and helped you find your way back to life. Sarah had never thought about her experience in the mine in these terms, but Singing Bird's interpretation made sense to her in a way that the Christian explanation she had grown up with never had. According to her childhood faith, her barrenness was either a punishment for sin or a test of faith that she was supposed to endure with patient suffering. But, according to Singing Bird, her barrenness was simply part of her personal medicine, her unique spiritual power that would manifest in ways that had nothing to do with childbearing. Not all women are meant to be mothers of children, Singing Bird told her. Some women are meant to be mothers of ideas, mothers of healing, mothers of courage. You survived 9 days alone in the earth. That tells us that your medicine is connected to endurance, to the ability to find life in places where others see only death. This perspective was so different from everything Sarah had been taught that it took weeks for her to fully accept it. But as winter deepened and she grew more comfortable with Cheyenne ways, she began to see evidence that Singing Bird was right. She had a natural talent for finding edible plants and roots even when they were hidden by snow. She could calm frightened horses with just her voice and touch. Most remarkably, she seemed to have an intuitive understanding of which sick people would recover and which were in danger of dying. This last ability became apparent during an outbreak of fever that struck the camp in late January. Several children and elderly people fell ill with high fevers and difficulty breathing. The tribal medicine man, a serious man named Hawk Flying, worked tirelessly to treat the sick, but he was clearly overwhelmed by the number of patients who needed his attention. Sarah found herself drawn to help with the care of the sick, despite having no formal medical training. At first, she simply fetched water and helped keep the patients comfortable. But gradually, she began to notice patterns in the illness that others seemed to miss. Some patients had a particular look in their eyes that seemed to indicate they would recover quickly. Others had a grayish pallor that suggested their condition was more serious than it appeared on the surface. When she mentioned these observations to Hawk Flying, he listened carefully and then began watching for the same signs. To his amazement, Sarah's instincts proved remarkably accurate. The patients she identified as being in serious danger were indeed the ones who needed the most intensive treatment, while those she sensed would recover quickly often improved with minimal intervention. "You have the sight," Hawk Flying told her after she had correctly predicted the outcome of more than a dozen cases. "This is a rare gift. With proper training, you could become a powerful healer." The idea that she might have a calling as a medicine woman was thrilling and terrifying to Sarah. In her old life, women were not supposed to have any role in medical treatment beyond basic nursing care. But among the Cheyenne, female healers were common and highly respected. Singing Bird had been a medicine woman in her younger days, before age and failing eyesight forced her to pass her responsibilities to others. As word of Sarah's abilities spread through the camp, people began coming to her for help with various ailments. At first, she was reluctant to offer advice, afraid that her lack of formal training would lead to someone being harmed. But Singing Bird encouraged her to trust her instincts and to learn by observing and practicing. Medicine is not something you learn only from books or teachers, Singing Bird explained. True healing comes from the ability to see into the spirit of a person and understand what their body and soul need to become whole again. You have this ability naturally. The training I can give you will help you use it more effectively, but the gift itself comes from the spirits. Under Singing Bird's tutelage, Sarah began learning about medicinal plants, the preparation of healing teas and poultices, and the spiritual practices that accompanied physical treatment. She learned that Cheyenne healing involved not just treating symptoms, but understanding the spiritual imbalance that had allowed illness to take hold in the first place. Every sickness has a message, Singing Bird taught her. Sometimes the message is that a person needs to change their way of living. Sometimes it is that they need to make peace with someone they have wronged. Sometimes it is that they need to accept something they have been fighting against. A good healer listens to what the sickness is trying to say. This holistic approach to healing resonated deeply with Sarah. It explained why some people recovered quickly from serious illnesses while others remained sick despite receiving the best medical care. Physical treatments were important, but they were only part of what was needed for true healing. As winter progressed, Sarah found herself becoming increasingly integrated into the life of the camp. She had learned enough Cheyenne to carry on simple conversations, and several of the younger women had become her close friends. Many Horses, the hunter who had first found her, often sought her out to share stories and teach her about the history and traditions of his people. Their relationship was complex and evolving in ways that neither of them had expected. Many Horses was clearly interested in her as more than just a friend, but he was respectful of her need to heal from the trauma she had experienced and to find her place in her new life before making any romantic commitments. "I have never known a woman like you," he told her one evening as they walked along the frozen river that ran past the camp. "You have survived things that would break most people, yet you have not become hard or bitter. You still have gentleness in your heart, but now it is combined with a strength that makes you formidable." Sarah appreciated his patience and understanding. Her marriage to Thomas had been arranged more for practical reasons than for love, and she had never experienced the kind of genuine attraction and mutual respect that was developing between her and Many Horses. But she was also wary of rushing into another relationship before she had fully understood what she wanted from her new life. "I'm still learning who I am," she told him. "The woman who was buried in that mine was someone I had been pretending to be for years. The woman who emerged is still discovering what she is capable of. I need time to understand my own heart before I can share it with someone else." Many Horses accepted this explanation with grace, but Sarah could see that his feelings for her were growing stronger with each passing day. The knowledge that this good, strong man cared for her was both comforting and challenging. It forced her to consider what kind of future she wanted to build, and whether that future might include love and marriage in a context very different from anything she had previously experienced. As February brought the deepest cold of the winter, Sarah faced her first real test of her healing abilities. Little Dove, the 5-year-old daughter of one of Singing Bird's other granddaughters, fell seriously ill with what appeared to be the same fever that had affected others in the camp. But this case was different. The child's fever was higher than any they had seen, and she was having difficulty breathing that grew worse with each passing hour. Hawkflying tried all of his usual remedies, but nothing seemed to help. The child's parents were beside themselves with worry, and the entire camp was holding its breath, afraid that they were about to lose one of their youngest members. Sarah sat with Little Dove through the night, holding her small hand and trying to sense what the illness was trying to communicate. Something about this case felt different from the others, more complex and urgent. As she watched the child struggle for breath, An intuition began to form in her mind. This is not the same fever that the others had, she told Hawk Flying. There is something else wrong, something in her chest. Hawk Flying examined the child more carefully and discovered that Sarah was right. Little Dove had developed pneumonia, a dangerous condition that required different treatment than the simple fever that had affected the other patients. Working together, Sarah and Hawk Flying developed a treatment plan that combined traditional Cheyenne healing methods with some techniques Sarah remembered from watching Dr. Williams treat similar cases in Millbrook. They created steam tents to help the child breathe more easily, prepared special teas to fight the infection, and took turns monitoring her condition around the clock. For 3 days, Little Dove's life hung in the balance. There were moments when Sarah was certain they were going to lose her, and other moments when the child seemed to rally and grow stronger. Throughout the crisis, Sarah found herself praying not to the distant, judgmental God of her childhood, but to the spirits that Singing Bird had taught her to recognize in all living things. On the 4th morning, Little Dove's fever broke. She sat up in bed and asked for water, and Sarah nearly wept with relief. The child's recovery was rapid and complete, and within a week she was playing with the other children as if nothing had happened. The successful treatment of Little Dove's illness marked a turning point in Sarah's acceptance by the community. Even the tribal members who had been most suspicious of her presence now regarded her as a valuable member of the band. More importantly, it gave Sarah confidence in her own abilities and helped her understand what Singing Bird had meant about having powerful medicine. "You saved my granddaughter's life," Little Dove's grandmother told her after the child had fully recovered. "Our family owes you a debt that can never be repaid." "The spirits guided the healing," Sarah replied, using the traditional response that Singing Bird had taught her. "I was only the instrument they chose to use." But privately, she felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her intuitive understanding of illness had made the difference between life and death for a child. It was the first time in her life that she had been able to use her abilities to truly help someone in a life-or-death situation. As winter began to show signs of giving way to spring, Sarah realized that her time of learning and healing in the Cheyenne camp was preparing her for something larger. She didn't yet know what that something might be, but she could feel change coming like the subtle shift in the wind that preceded the spring thaw. Many horses continued to court her with patience and respect, bringing her gifts of beautiful beadwork and carved bone ornaments. Singing Bird continued to teach her advanced healing techniques and the deeper spiritual practices of the Cheyenne people. And all around her, the community that had welcomed her as a refugee was beginning to treat her as a full member of the tribe. But Sarah could sense that this peaceful winter interlude was not meant to be permanent. She was being prepared for something, though she didn't yet understand what. The dreams that came to her during the long winter nights were filled with images of travel, of confrontation, and of choices that would affect not just her own future, but the futures of many other people. As the snow began to melt and the first green shoots of spring grass appeared along the riverbank, Sarah knew that her time of preparation was drawing to a close. Soon, she would need to decide what to do with the strength and knowledge she had gained during her winter among the Cheyenne. The woman who had been buried alive for her barrenness had been reborn as someone with the power to heal and to help others. Now it was time to discover how that power was meant to be used in the world beyond the winter camp. Spring arrived at the Cheyenne winter camp with a sudden rush of warmth that melted the snow in rushing streams and brought wildflowers bursting from the earth overnight. Sarah had been with her adopted people for 5 months, and the transformation in her was remarkable. The pale, frightened woman who had emerged from the mine had become strong and confident, her skin bronzed by sun and weather, her movements graceful and sure. She spoke Cheyenne fluently now and had earned respect throughout the band for her healing abilities and her courage. But as the warming weather made travel possible again, Sarah found herself facing a decision she had been avoiding all winter. Messages had begun arriving from other Cheyenne bands and from trading posts, carrying news of the outside world. Among these reports was information that made Sarah's blood run cold. There had been an outbreak of cholera in several frontier settlements, including Millbrook. The disease had struck in early spring, just as people were emerging from their cabins after the long winter. According to the reports, more than 30 people had died, including several children and elderly residents. The settlement's only doctor, Dr. Williams, had been among the first to succumb to the illness, leaving the community with no medical expertise to fight the epidemic. When Singing Bird shared this news with Sarah, the old woman watched her granddaughter's face carefully. "You are thinking of going back to help them," she observed. Sarah nodded slowly. "They tried to murder me. They buried me alive because they believed I was cursed. But they're still dying of a disease that I might be able to help treat. How can I turn away from that suffering, even if they cause me such pain?" "It would be dangerous for you to return," many horses said when Sarah discussed her thoughts with him. "They believe you are dead. If you appear among them again, they might think you are a ghost or a demon. Their fear could lead them to harm you again. Or they might realize that their judgment was wrong," Sarah replied. "Maybe seeing me alive and healthy with the ability to help them in their time of need will make them understand that their beliefs about curses and divine punishment were based on ignorance and fear rather than truth." Singing Bird was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as she considered Sarah's dilemma. Finally, she spoke. "You have powerful medicine, granddaughter. Medicine is meant to be used to help people, even people who have wronged you. But you must be wise about how you use it. Going back to your old settlement alone would be foolish and dangerous. What do you suggest?" Sarah asked. "Take many horses with you, and take some of the other young warriors who can protect you if the white people's fear makes them dangerous again. Present yourself not as the woman they tried to kill, but as a healer who has come to help them in their time of need. Let your actions speak louder than words about who you truly are and what you represent." Many horses immediately agreed to accompany her, and 3 other warriors volunteered to join the expedition. They spent several days preparing for the journey, gathering medicinal supplies and discussing strategy. Sarah would approach Millbrook openly, making no attempt to hide her identity or her association with the Cheyenne. If the settlers wanted her help, they would have to accept her as she was now, not as the broken woman they had tried to destroy. The journey to Millbrook took 4 days, traveling at a steady pace across country that brought back memories both painful and precious. Sarah recognized landmarks from her old life, a distinctive rock formation where she and Thomas had sometimes picnicked, a stream where she had liked to gather watercress for their table, a hillside meadow where wildflowers had bloomed each spring. But these places looked different to her now, viewed through eyes that had been opened to a wider understanding of what life could be. As they approached the settlement, the signs of the cholera epidemic became obvious. The usual sounds of daily activity were muted, and they could see fresh graves in the cemetery that had tripled its size since Sarah's supposed death. Smoke rose from only about half the chimneys that should have been active, suggesting that many families were either dead or too sick to maintain normal household routines. Sarah called a halt when they reached the hill overlooking the settlement. "Let me go down alone first," she told many horses. "If they react badly to seeing me, there's no need for all of us to be in danger." "I will not let you face them alone," many horses replied firmly. "We go together, or not at all." They compromised by having many horses accompany her, while the other warriors remained on the hilltop, ready to ride to their aid if necessary. Sarah and many horses rode slowly down the main street of Millbrook, and she was shocked by how small and shabby the settlement looked compared to her memories. The buildings that had once seemed solid and prosperous now appeared cramped and poorly constructed. The carefully ordered layout that had once represented civilization and godliness to her now looked rigid and artificial. People began emerging from their homes as word spread that strangers were approaching. Sarah recognized many faces, but they were thinner than she remembered, marked by illness and fear. When the first person recognized her, the reaction was everything many horses had predicted it might be. "Dear God in heaven," gasped Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had once worried about Sarah's barrenness affecting her own pregnancy. "It's Sarah Morrison. But she's reburied. How can she be alive?" Word spread through the settlement like wildfire. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered in the street, staring at Sarah with a mixture of fear, amazement, and growing hostility. She noticed that Thomas was not among them, and she wondered if he had died in the epidemic or simply left the settlement after her supposed death. Elder Morrison pushed through the crowd, his face pale with shock. He had aged significantly in the months since Sarah had last seen him, and she could see the toll that the epidemic had taken on his health and spirit. "This cannot be," he said, his voice shaking. "Sarah Morrison died last fall. He couldn't bring himself to say what they had done to her. I survived, Sarah said simply, her voice calm and strong. The mine you seal me in had other passages. I found a way out. But if you're alive, said James, Thomas's brother, then the curse, the bad luck that's been affecting our settlement. There was no curse, Sarah interrupted. There was only fear and ignorance. You blame me for every misfortune that befell your community, but people get sick and crops fail and children die because that's part of life, especially life on the frontier. My barrenness had nothing to do with any of those things. The crowd murmured uneasily, some people making the sign of the cross, others backing away, as if they thought she might be some kind of vengeful spirit. I haven't come back for revenge, Sarah continued. I've come to help. I've heard about the cholera epidemic, and I've learned skills during my time away that might be useful in treating the sick. Time away? Elder Morrison's voice was sharp with suspicion. Where have you been? And who is this savage you've brought with you? Sarah felt many horses tense beside her at the insulting term, but she laid a gentle hand on his arm to keep him calm. I've been living with the Cheyenne people, she said proudly. They found me dying of starvation and exposure after I escaped from the mine, and they saved my life. They welcomed me into their tribe and taught me the healing arts. Many Horses is my friend and protector, and I would ask you to show him the respect due to someone who has shown me kindness when my own people showed me only cruelty. The crowd reacted with shock and fear to the revelation that Sarah had been living among Indians. Several people called out questions and accusations. How could she associate with savages? Had she been corrupted by their heathen ways? Was she now more savage than Christian? I have learned, Sarah said, raising her voice to be heard over the tumult, that the measure of a person's worth has nothing to do with the color of their skin or the language they speak. It has to do with how they treat others, especially others who are weak and in need of help. The Cheyenne people, whom you call savages, treated me with more Christian charity than this supposedly godly community ever did. Elder Morrison's face was red with anger and embarrassment. You dare to lecture us about Christian behavior? You, who have been living in sin among the enemies of civilization. I dare to speak the truth, Sarah replied calmly. And the truth is that you are facing a crisis that is beyond your ability to handle alone. I have knowledge that might save lives, but I will only share it with people who are willing to treat me and my companion with basic human decency. At that moment, a woman Sarah didn't recognize came running down the street toward them. She was young, probably in her early 20s, and her face was streaked with tears. Please, she gasped as she reached the crowd. Please, if you're a healer, you have to help my children. My youngest, little Mary, she's burning up with fever, and my boy Tommy can barely breathe. Dr. Williams is dead, and nobody knows what to do. Sarah looked at the desperate mother, then at the hostile faces of the crowd around her. Many of these people had stood by while she was condemned to die for the crime of being unable to bear children. Some had probably participated in sealing her in the mine. But here was a woman whose children were dying, begging for help that only Sarah might be able to provide. I'll come, Sarah said to the woman. Show me where they are. Don't trust her, Margaret, Elder Morrison warned. She's been corrupted by savages. God knows what kind of heathen practices she might try to use on Christian children. Sarah turned to face Elder Morrison directly. Would you rather maintain your pride and prejudice, or would you rather save the lives of innocent children? Because those are your choices. I can help these people, but not if you continue to treat me as an enemy instead of someone who has come to offer aid. The crowd fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. They needed help desperately, but accepting it would mean acknowledging that they had been wrong about her, that their attempt to murder her had been based on superstition and ignorance rather than divine guidance. Finally, an elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson stepped forward. Sarah remembered her as one of the few people who had always been kind to her during her years in Millbrook. Elder Morrison, Mrs. Peterson said firmly, my grandson is dying of this fever. If Sarah thinks she can help him, I'm going to let her try. Whatever else she may be, she's not cruel. She wouldn't come back here to hurt children. Her words broke the deadlock. Other people began speaking up, admitting that they had family members who were sick and that they were willing to accept help from anyone who might be able to save their loved ones. Sarah and many horses followed Margaret to her small cabin, where they found 2 children in the grip of high fevers and severe dehydration. Sarah immediately recognized the symptoms of cholera a disease she had learned to treat during her time with the Cheyenne. The tribal healers had encountered the disease when it spread along trading routes, and they had developed effective treatments that combined traditional remedies with practical nursing care. Working quickly, Sarah began preparing the treatments she had learned. She boiled water and added specific herbs to create a rehydration solution, set up steam tents to help the children breathe more easily, and showed Margaret how to monitor their conditions and provide supportive care. Many horses proved invaluable in helping her gather the medicinal plants she needed. His knowledge of local flora, combined with her understanding of which plants had properties similar to those used in Cheyenne medicine, allowed them to create effective remedies from materials available in the area around Millbrook. Word of their success spread quickly through the settlement. Within hours, other families were bringing their sick relatives to Margaret's cabin, begging Sarah to help them as